Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this third and last World Café of the Global Fellowship Initiative, also known as GFI at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. My name is Laurent Sierro. I'm a reporter and a journalist in residence at the Global Fellowship Initiative. This is a series that we started on Wednesday in the framework of the 25th anniversary of the GCSP. But there is a broader whole festival of events for these celebrations. So I'll invite you to check them on the website of the GCSP, that's gcsp.ch. It's still time to register for the remaining ones. Having discussed technology and security 2 days ago and humanitarian affairs and security yesterday, we're addressing today the regional perspective in the Middle East and Africa 1 generation ago, today, and in the next 25 years. Due to this short informal format, we won't take any question from the viewers today, but we'll collect your comments in the chat box function. If you do so, as this session is recorded, for GDPR's compliance reasons, you're free to, if you don't want your name to be identified in the chat box, you're free to change it into alias or initials. Now, it's my pleasure to be joined by 3 distinguished guests, our 2 days guests in alphabetical order. Laurent Anderson, founder and CEO of LC Anderson International Consulting and former FBI executive. Good morning, Laurent. It's very early in the US, so thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Laurent. It's my pleasure to be with everybody today.
Then Joseph Baou, who is the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. Good afternoon, Joseph.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi.
Yeah, thank you for being with us. And then Yvette Stevens, who had a long-standing and distinguished career in multilateralism, former permanent representative of Sierra Leone to the UN in Geneva. Good afternoon, Yvette. It's very good to have you.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be part of this.
So as we did in the first 2 sessions, before getting into the substance, we start with a very short first round with every speaker with very simple questions. First, where were you 25 years ago? And then what did security mean to you personally back then? Let's start with Laurent.
Thank you very much. So 25 years ago, I was working at FBI headquarters and 11 years into my FBI career. And at that point in time, I was focused very much on counterterrorism, and I oversaw programs for the FBI across the United States on what we refer to as state sponsors of terrorism at the time, so Iraq, Libya, Syria, and non-state actors that were largely the Palestinian organizations that were engaged in acts of terrorism, such as the Abu Nidal organization. And that assignment came on the heels of many years of working counterintelligence involving China and the former Soviet Union. It was also at a time period that the FBI, after the first World Trade Center attack in 1993, was recognizing that we had a rise globally, and certainly others were ahead of the United States in recognizing this, of Islamic extremism and trying to understand the impact that would have on us going forward. So we had already at that point of time begin to develop expertise and identify analysts who could work with us and do a better job of understanding what was happening. Of course, you had the Algerian civil war going on, you had issues in Sudan, and you have Osama bin Laden and Abu Nidal in that time period, both welcomed into countries in Africa. And Africa had not historically been a focus for the FBI because we were not expanded globally yet that far into Africa. It was largely in Europe and other parts of the world. Yeah. So for me personally, that's what I was living on a daily basis, was understanding terrorism. I did not focus on terrorism in the United States. We had our own major issues with that. So my focus 25 years ago was largely global and very much regionally focused on Africa, and the Middle East.
Joseph, what about you?
"25 years ago" means it was in 1995. I was still a relatively young scholar. I was freshly back from Paris from a long period of semi-exile there, partly because I was studying there, but partly also because I was waiting for the last years of the civil war in Lebanon to finish and wind down. So I was freshly back to Beirut. I just started at that moment my professional career as a professor and researcher, but I was very much interested in the climate and in the environment within which Lebanon was getting to life back again after the civil war. And this was something that impacted me personally, professionally, and politically very much. 1995 was 5 years after the end of the civil war in Lebanon and the negotiation of the Taif agreement. For me, it was a huge lesson of post-war, let's say, mediation, war exit, political reconstruction, and physical reconstruction. So I was really learning much. Looking at things from within, because I started then my PhD dissertation that was mainly focused on the negotiations of the end of the war agreement. So I learned a lot in terms of, let's say, civil war resolution, conflict resolution, post-war rebuilding, etc., etc.
Yeah.
The second thing that I was very much also looking into, and that was the period, 1995 was exactly 5 years after the launch of the peace process, of the regional peace process, the Madrid process. And then it was 1 year before we started to see that this process was not going anywhere. It was 1 year before the assassination of Ishaq Rabin in Israel. Tensions were
Don't say,
starting to
Joseph,
rise.
don't say
Yes?
too much. We're getting back to that in the discussion.
So to put it in a nutshell, these were very richly formative years for me, both on the professional level, on the political level, because I was starting to do some politics in Lebanon, and on the personal level also, because it determined a lot the choices that I made later on, and that led me to where I am today.
Very good. Thank you. And Yvette, what about you? Wait a second, Yvette, you're muted.
Yeah. 25 years ago, I was in Geneva during the meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan, and which led to the creation of GCSP. Then I was in charge within UNHCR for the unit that was responsible for setting up camps and settlements for refugees. Later on that year, I was made deputy representative of the UNHCR to Ethiopia. One thing that happened, because this was just after the Rwanda genocide, and we were involved a lot in accommodating refugees fleeing from Rwanda. We had a contingency plan for 50,000. And as you know, we had ended up having to accommodate over 1 million refugees who crossed the border. Later on that year, when I became deputy representative to Ethiopia, I realized I had a first-hand account and did a lot of thinking as, yes, it's good to have humanitarian assistance to refugees, but isn't humanitarian assistance the fig leaf by which the international community used to compensate for its inability to address solutions relating to the influx of refugees, and also solutions relating to the root causes, to addressing the root causes. This was why not long after I was in New York as director for Africa in DESA. One of the roles I played was monitoring the Secretary General's report, which I think is very important to read, which was on the root causes of conflict and the promotion of durable solution and sustainable development in Africa. I had that responsibility to report to the General Assembly on the implementation of that report.
Yeah, let's follow up on that and to start our discussion with you, Yvette, on the substantial part, because you mentioned it, we were just in Africa 1 year after the genocide in Rwanda, and we were in the middle of these civil wars in the environment post-Cold War, with a lot of different wars, Burundi, Liberia, insurgencies as well in DRC. And in your own country, Sierra Leone, you were in the middle of the civil war. So a huge period of instability. What lessons do you draw today from this period? How was the situation for the whole region in terms of instability, and how you depict that today?
Yes, you're right. In 1995, 1996, it was estimated that 14 out of the 54 countries of Africa had interstate conflicts. But Africa has made tremendous progress in this direction, because between that time and today, most of these interstate conflicts, and you rightly mentioned, was also in my country, they were resolved. And we had a period whereby we enjoyed relative peace. And then important in all this is that the OAU transformed to the African Union, which had the responsibility, unlike the OAU, which was looking at ending colonialism. The AU stretched the mandate of the regional organization to look into economic and political integration. And also there were many things which changed during this period, which also Africa, it was very remarkable, as in 2001, it was when the realization of Africa that its own development lies in its own hands, and they needed to assume ownership of that process. And this led to the new Partnership for Africa's Development, transforming the donor-benefactor attitude to one of partnership with the international community. And as I said, this had remarkable, but the problem with present day, if you look at the instability and in Africa, a lot of it also has to do with terrorism. And this is where terrorism has emerged and come out with its ugly head. Because yesterday I was listening to this presentation, and you see that ISIS, for instance, moved southwards to Africa. And we are having all this instability in Africa because of ISIS. And that is really having an impact on where Africa wanted to be. And so that is precisely restricted some of the activities which Africa need to do to be able to get out of these conflict-related actions through development, economic development.
Thank you, Joseph. You mentioned, you started to touch on the different components of the context in your region, and you've worked a lot on the relationship between Lebanon and Syria. And it's interesting to see that today a lot of Syrians moved to Lebanon because of the civil war. But at that time, Lebanon was still under the Syrian control. So tell us a little bit more about that. And the context that you touched upon with also the Oslo II agreements, and then a few months later, Yitzhak Rabin's assassination.
Yes, in fact, the 90s in Lebanon were under these two dynamics: the dynamics of post-war political reconstruction under tutelage, under the Syrian tutelage and the heavy hand of Syria in Lebanon, and second, under the umbrella or within the context of the peace process that was launched at that time and that was unfolding. And the two are very tied because partly, and this is something we often forget, partly the role that was devoted to Syria and Lebanon by the international community, with a kind of permissiveness of the international community at that time, was partly a way to bribe, quote unquote, Syria in order to be more flexible and amenable to the peace process in the region. So the quid pro quo was that Syria would take a lot of influence in Lebanon under the, let's say, the permissivity or the agreement of the US, Europe, and the Gulf states at that time, in exchange for a flexible position in the peace process and help advance this peace process in the region. This is why, and this is maybe a sideshow, but it's important today, this is why the Syrian behavior in Lebanon and the behavior of the political class in Lebanon that was acting within this kind of Syrian protectorate on the country is at the root cause probably of the problems that Lebanon is living today. The corruption networks that were at that time Syrian and Lebanese. After Syria was ousted from Lebanon in 2005, they became grossly purely Lebanese. The issue of Hezbollah, that started at that moment because Hezbollah was groomed under Syria's, let's say, heavy hand in Lebanon in order to provide Syria with a strong leverage in the peace process at the Madrid and post-Madrid table of negotiation. And also the problems of, let's say, the many sociological layers of Syrian-Lebanese entanglement, and the one you are mentioning, the Syrian refugees today in Lebanon, if you put it in a region, in a historical context, is not something new. There has been always something like 500,000 to 1 million Syrian nationals working, moving, living permanently or less permanently in Lebanon. We have to acknowledge and to remember that Lebanese construction in the 70s and reconstruction in the 90s was partly and largely due to Syrian workforce in Lebanon. So the refugee issue is something that is not completely new, although it is taking a new shade and shape with the fact that these are today refugees and not workers, and the fact that Syria is today a dismantled state and not anymore the omnipotent state in Lebanon. The big anxiety in Lebanon is about knowing if these people are one day coming back to their country, which leads you to a second anxiety and to a second set of questions that has to do with the survivability of the Syrian regime and the Syrian state as such, the Syrian entity as such. So this is to say that today's problems are very much tied to the problems that were brewing at that time. Yeah. The unfortunate thing is that in Lebanon, we often tend to look at the problems as if they were the product of yesterday and not the product of a long dynamic. We often tend to forget that these things have a continuity and that we have to look at them in a very long and broad time perspective and geographical perspective, because all this has to do also with the regional let's say dynamic, the resolution of the question in Syria, and the resolution of the show of force and the bras de fer between the West and Iran over the nuclear issue. So Lebanese are always, let's say, sandwiched between the immediate local and domestic problems and the very long-term and very entangled regional conundrum. And they have often a hard time and difficulty to find a proper place between the very local and the very macro and the very regional, let's say, set of dynamics. So this is why, I mean, having lived in the 90s in Lebanon helps you a lot to confront and to approach the problems of today, because it gives you a sense of broad perspective and a sense of long-term, let's say, lenses and approach that is very useful in order to understand and approach the issues of today.
Very good, thank you, Laurent. We come back to 1995. You know both regions quite well, actually. Yeah, what's your how do you look to the situation there back then?
In that part of the world?
Yeah.
Well, it has been referred to by both Joseph and Yvette. There's always been so much turmoil in that particular region, but what we were seeing from an American perspective is that what at one point may have been self-contained within a particular country, conflict or wars, and that is not to minimize them in any way, but we begin to see this spreading outside of the region and impacting countries outside that area. And I think that that's important because as you have the development of, as Abu Nidal organization, for example, starts to wane, you have the rise of Al-Qaeda, and then obviously much later years in this 20 years, the rise of ISIS. But that was a dramatic change. And what that brought about from my perspective is it almost forced, but it came about in a good way, to have much greater collaboration and sharing and working together with colleagues in other parts of the world. Whereas previously it was a matter from the US perspective of, all right, well, we're going to tell you that we know how to do this and, you know, we'll share this information with you. But to me, that was one of the great parts of this time period, is that development and recognition that working together and collaborating together with everyone was going to have a far greater impact on security. Is it the complete answer? Absolutely not the complete answer. But it was a recognition that I think was really important and has brought us to today, even though we are confronted with many, many issues, and there continue to be conflicts both within countries and with non-state actors. The fact that we have gotten to that point is incredible as far as I'm concerned. And I think that is a very good development. And I want to refer back also to something that Yvette said earlier, talking about how humanitarian aid was flooding in because of, I'm going to use these words, but the sense of guilt of not paying attention when aid could have been brought in. And that is one positive thing that we see and have seen in the security sector, is that there was much more of a willingness to not say, here's what you need, but what do you need? And how is it that we can work together to bring that about? So for example, there was a Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Initiative still underway with a different name that started in the early 2000s. And that brought all of the players around the Sahel together, which was an important point. And we sat and talked. And instead of just saying, well, we're going to bring this in, one of the questions that was posed was, what do you need? If there was one thing you needed from a security perspective in this region of Africa, what would it be? And the single thing that they said is, we need to have a means of communication, just to facilitate the communication because of the vastness of the region. And so to me, the turn of the West to begin saying, okay, what are things we can bring to the table was critical. And our cooperation also started growing further, as I believe Joseph knows, in the Middle East as well. And just to me, overall, watching that morph, that change, it became imperative because we have seen too much going on outside the region. And for me, that's been a critical thing, and having those partnerships, developing that way. And the one other thing I want to mention in here, which hasn't been touched on in any of these other issues before we move on, is gender. We've had all these discussions on security today and the others that have been held this week, and nobody's really touched on the gender aspect. And I think that's critical, because when we look at the evolution over the last 25 years, you had decisions largely being made by men. There were very few women. We were dealing with conflicts all over. And I know, and a lot of the people listening know, and I'm sure everybody in our panel knows, that having greater diversity is critical if we're going to build peace, sustain peace, and have those voices heard. And diversity could be religious, ethnic, gender, doesn't matter, but that's critical. And that's an evolution that I've also seen in the years since '95. Not enough. You know, at the time I was one of only 5 women in the entire FBI managing terrorism programs in 1995. But that's changed dramatically. So I think we can't underestimate, not from my experience only, but the gender aspect and how the fact that we have more women leaders in Africa, we need more women leaders in the Middle East as well, and that this has the real possibility to make significant and substantial change and help to try and bring about peace that will be more sustainable. Yeah,
thanks for that, Laureen. Actually, that's a component that we wanted to raise also for the current state of play. And Joseph, we saw a lot of young people and especially young women in Beirut streets in the recent month, after all the sequence with the social movements and that blow this summer. So is it the time for, as the time for women in the Middle East come?
I think this is a tremendously important point that is often underlooked. Yes, exactly. Not only in Lebanon, but in other surrounding countries. Let me say that the revolutions that have started in 2011 in the Arab region, and then in Lebanon more particularly with the civil movement that has started to consolidate in 2015, 2016 with the garbage issue, and later on in 2017, in 2019 with the revolution, the October Revolution, we have witnessed a much higher participation of women, not only in the sense of they were active in the streets or in the protest movement, but also brandishing and raising the issues that are proper to the gender question. Partly also we have seen other quote-unquote minorities, I hate this word put in this context, very much active in a world, in the Arab world, in a sociology, in a society where inclusiveness and pluralism, sociologically I mean, is very low and very poor. We have seen the rise of quote-unquote minorities to the forefront. It's the first time in the Arab world you listen people talking about gender rights, LGBT rights. Sometimes in Lebanon, we have heard this issue in the streets, and now they are very active in the drafting and the crafting of the civil society that is trying to consolidate. So this is a new landscape that I think it would be urgent to look at from a Western perspective, and forget that politics and civil movements are only made by let's say elderly males in this part of the region. Let me add something that is very dear to me as a Lebanese. Also, we were mentioning the war and the post-war. You know, I've lived the war in Lebanon, and this is something that relates very much to what Laureen is saying. I'm very conscious, and I'm one person who can witness personally to the very strong role and very important role that women play usually during conflicts. I'm very deeply convinced that the resilience of societies, their durability, their ability to get out of a conflict alive is completely a function of women's role in society. Without women's role during 15 years of war in Lebanon, probably we would have lost a generation completely in terms of education, of upbringing, of solidity of the family structure, etc., etc. I know plenty of examples, and I'm one of them, where under the shelling, with very hard conditions of living, women were the perpetuators of the values of society, of education, of providing basic things, whereby men were much more cowardly behaving, let's say, in these situations. I think that both our colleagues here on the screen can witness to that. I can testify for that very vividly and very personally. I owe much to my mother. I owe much to my sisters. I owe much to other women in society that help us stay mentally healthy, that help us keep our education going on under duress, and after the war that help us keep our heads cold in periods where men or other people could be driven towards very irrational sorts of behavior. So I think that this part of the gender issue in conflicts and post-conflict is not only a gadget that we put in our research project or in our political action just for fundraising or for being politically correct towards international organizations. It's something very real, very concrete, and very vivid.
Yeah, Yvette, what Laureen said about FBI and what Joseph just said about Lebanon is also true to Africa, right? Because it's after that sequence of civil wars that we started to see the first women leaders like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf for Liberia, for instance. But 25 years later, actually, we're also celebrating 25 years of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action on Women. But what's the outcome 25 years later? Have we done enough in Africa?
Let me first start by saying, for many of the conflict resolution in Africa, women played a dominant role. If you look at the West African conflict, the women were there. The women were even at the peace conferences, sitting at the hotel and lobbying for certain things which would have been forgotten completely. So the women did play a role. And also, you should also see that also now, of course, we had the first female elected president in Liberia, but we also had the head of the African Union, a woman headed the African Union. And it was during her time that we came out with the agenda, what is called the Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want. And this was spearheaded and was by a woman leader in Africa. So increasingly we are showing leadership in terms of for women in Africa. We still have obstacles to overcome. For instance, the political parties hesitate to put women in the positions where they could have that power to do things. And it's still a problem which Africa has to address. How do we get women into the political process? And this goes far back down also to within the political parties themselves, because there are no women candidates, then there's going to be no women at the table in terms of the parliament. But Africa we are moving slowly. And I believe that we have to bring out some of these successful women and try to look at role models that would be accepted by Africans, because that makes a whole lot of a difference. We have to stress these role models and their achievements. And this will help the community as a whole to accept that women can make a difference, and sometimes can even make a difference, a positive difference in relation to men.
Thank you. Before we take the last 10 minutes to really try to address the prospects for the next 25 years with that new normal that was provoked by the COVID. Laurent, just in 1 or 2 minutes, I think for you, one of the major disruptions also in the last 25 years in Africa was the growing influence of China. Could you tell us a little bit more about that in 1-2 minutes max?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's critical because the West largely took their eye off the ball, to use a sports metaphor, in understanding China's growing influence in Africa. And in the 5+ years that I was working and living in the region, I saw that. And the telecommunications industry, weapons coming in, there were a whole lot of areas that even in the early 2000s, China was quietly putting a footprint down all over Africa. And the West, certainly the United States, I will say, was not paying enough attention to it, in my opinion. And the issue of Russia's influence had disappeared with the end of the Cold War. So although you had vestiges of it in parts of the world, in the Middle East and Africa, it did not have the kind of influence that it previously had. And certainly the United States and Western Europe, they were largely dominant forces. But that China influence, which has only grown, was so obvious 20 years ago, 20+ years ago. And I think the failure to recognize it has gotten us to the point where we are today, where there's many good things that they have brought to the continent. But I know Yvette, and I'm sure Joseph has their opinions as well. It's also brought things that have created more turmoil and personal distress on a financial level for a lot of Africans who have agreed to accept aid for their business or in certain parts of different countries, and then find themselves in a point where they can't keep up with the finances. So I think that that's a pivotal point. And if we look at China worldwide and where it stands, and those who are saying, and I take no position on it personally, China will overtake the US, that's possible. But I think that that's important for us to consider, is we can't look and focus as security professionals on one issue at a time. We have got to be much more global in the way that we look at everything happening around the world, because we're so completely interconnected that there's no getting away with that. And if we're smart, we're looking at everything on some level so that we can see trends before they happen, which goes into your next question. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Joseph, there are also a lot of different countries that had influence recently on the broader Middle East region. That's Russia, Turkey, Iran. We saw that in Syria and in Libya, if we take into account that Libya is part of that broader Middle East. As we enter that new normal affected by COVID, how do you see the next, let's say, first the short term and then the long range prospect in the next 25 years changing? Could COVID be a disruptive factor in that kind of state of play? And how do you see things going for the next 25 years?
Yes, let me answer this question by maybe looking ahead beyond COVID only and looking at the next 2 decades that are coming in the Middle East and probably elsewhere in the world. I see 3 levels that are important or interesting to look at. The first one is the global level. At the global level, you have a big question related to the, let's say, the way America will rebrand or revisit its involvement in the world. You know, this huge debate about American retrenchment, American retreat, American, let's say, selfishness, of which the Trump era was only part of the expression. I think it goes well beyond Trumpism. Are we witnessing the last years of the American century or a renewed American century? I think this is a broad question. It has to do with the second point, which is the return to a superpower's global competition in the world. You have now a new triangle between US, Russia, China, and things are very much volatile at that level. And I think it will impact a lot the next 2 decades to come, with China becoming much more assertive and a Russia that has been assertive for the last 10 years, but without the means to sustain this assertiveness, and an America that is still soul searching at that level, having the means to stay a global power, but without the will to stay a global player as it was before. And this is where probably something is being discussed and brewed in the American, let's say, corridors of power. The third issue has to do with the rise of regional superpowers, as you mentioned. Today, we have a landscape where regional superpowers, if they cannot impose a solution, can impede any solution that is not to their likes. Turkey, Iran, Israel, the Gulf states, smaller players like maybe Greece tomorrow can impede a solution or torpedo it. They have a lot of spoiling capacity, more than an imposing capacity, and global powers have to take this into account. And I think that this will bode also on the evolutions for the next 2 decades or the 3 next decades. The last point that has to do with your question is that we have the increasing rise of challenges that are by definition purely transnational. COVID is one of them. Pandemics more globally is one of them. We have lived the Ebola issue. We lived the AIDS era. Now we're living the COVID era. We will increasingly have sanitary and health issues that have to be tackled in a more multinational, multilateral, transnational way. And I'm not sure that the international system is efficiently enough equipped for that. And we have the rise of new global threats like climate change, renewable energy, etc., that need a new, let's say, formulation of what multilateralism in the 21st century means. This is why I think that institutions like GCSP and others have a lot to do. They have a lot on their plates in order to understand first these dynamics, and second, to formulate partly the answers to these dynamics. So I think that we're entering in a very volatile new world. And we know the answer, we know the questions, but we don't have enough answers for them.
Yeah, thank you. Yvette, there are 2 or 3 elements that are concerning right now in Africa. Actually, first time since 1995 that the continent will go through a recession, economic recession this year because of the COVID. And first time globally, but that's a lot about Africa as well, that extreme poverty in the world will rise. in almost 25 years as well. So we saw the gains in a generation that might be compromised by COVID. But at the same time, we feel that it's a period of opportunity for the region, because we saw the different initiatives to empower the region from external influences. Do you think that that's new normal will be the time where Africa will really become free of external influences?
Let me first start by saying that, yes, Africa, in terms of natural resources, Africa is the richest region of the world. And yet, Africa remains the poorest region of the world. Africans remain the poorest. And whatever have been used, whatever policies have been adopted over the years has not moved Africa to where it is supposed to be. And Africa will only be where it's supposed to be when it has, for instance, fair terms of trade, for instance. Why is it that with all the natural resources, Africa cannot benefit? Okay, there are other internal problems which need to be addressed, like corruption, you can say that. There are many other things that have to be addressed, but Africa is still not where it should be. And I think one thing that came out over the years is that Africa cannot wholly depend on going around with a begging bowl and hoping that overseas development assistance is going to remove or take it to where it should be. We all know, and just to reiterate the link between poverty and the conflict, root cause of conflict in Africa, I would say, is poverty. And unless that poverty is addressed, Africa will be in this position. So what I want to say is that Africa decided to look outwards. Apart from the traditional countries that had assisted Africa in the past, it's not only China, for instance. We have more relationships with Brazil, with other parts of the world, because Africa has realized that it has to pull all whatever resources it could get to be able to develop itself, to be able to address poverty, which is the root causes of all the instability and conflict and wars in Africa. So Africa is looking at, of course, Africa has to be cautious. And I think what Laurent said is true. One should not fall into the trap that you look outwards and then you get into problems that really would not allow you to move in the direction in which you are planning to move. Now, it is unfortunate because, as you said, Africa was doing very well economically. And this COVID crisis is really going to impact on Africa. It's going to in more ways than one, because even though Africa has been lucky, by the way, in terms of the severity of the COVID crisis, but still it's going to be impacted by what is happening in other parts of the world. And this is something which is unfortunate at a time when Africa believed that it was already moving in the right direction. The recent African Free Trade Area, for instance, would address some of that Africa has, and also the changes that have happened, because with the African Union and the regional, sub-regional organizations involving more and more in resolution of conflict, in fact, in preventing conflicts occurring in the first place. In West Africa, for instance, ECOWAS intervened in Liberia, in Gambia, and they were able to avert conflict. So that is one way that they are moving. The only problem that still remains is that of terrorism. And this is where Africa would also count on partners to assist it to address this growing threat from terrorism, which even when everything is put in place, would still affect the development in the continent. People will still remain poor and the wars will continue.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good way to turn us to end with Laurent. We're running a little bit out of time, but we enjoyed that so much in these 3 days that we just want to go on for a few minutes. Laurent, to end with you, the experts the security expert that you are, how do you see the challenges with that new normal ahead in both regions?
Thank you for asking the question. And I like to consider myself an eternal optimist. So I am going to choose to focus on what I see are the positive opportunities going forward. And the pandemic, while it has created tremendous chaos around the world, it is the one thing that we all have that unites us. and it's an opportunity that we can take and work together and move forward together or not. And I'd rather see us move forward together and build on the kinds of collaborations that were there. I agree with Yvette that the growth of partnerships regionally within and among African nations is critical. You know, there was recently an announcement by Tanzania and Mozambique about their beginning cooperation to fight back ISIS, which has now gotten a foothold in the oil-rich part of the north of Mozambique and Cabo Delgado. And so to see those kinds of partnerships growing, and yes, the West and other parts of the world that have expertise can help bring that into the situation. But that's a tremendous plus, is to see that kind of regional cooperation going on. And I also feel strongly, as I said earlier, that the rise of women and getting more women into positions of power in politics and in every segment of society will make a change, because in the places where that has occurred and where there is sustained peace, it makes a difference. You know, one little thing to mention here before I pass on with it is that if we look at all of the peace agreements that were negotiated since 1991 up to the present time, the percentage of women involved has been under 5%. But where they have been involved, as Yvette talks about, that peace has been sustained. But the other thing that happens when women are at the table, and that's why it's so important going forward, is typically in peace agreements, there's never even a mention of security of the civilian population and women and youth after a conflict ends. And so that's why, to me, going forward, and express my optimism in the growth of women getting into and interested in politics, the incredible activism that we saw and continue to see in the Middle East and in North Africa by women and in other parts of the world as well. That, to me, is a game changer going forward if we are all willing to embrace that and embrace working together and not fall back into the nationalism trap and really look forward in a multilateral way, because we cannot move forward in a positive way in the world if it's not done hand in hand with each other.
Thank you very much, Laureen. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Yvette. That was a very stimulating discussion. Thank you to our viewers throughout the last 3 days. And happy birthday, GCSP. I've said that in the first 2 talks, but it's still the time to say that. So happy birthday to the GCSP, and bye-bye.